Before we dive into this incredible story, make sure you're part of our journey. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and get ready for a story that will leave you thinking. And if you love inspiring tales, a like goes a long way. Nobody has time for lost children anymore. The words hung in the cold night air as another stranger hurried past, eyes deliberately avoiding the small figure huddled against the storefront. 6-year-old Ethan clutched his teddy bear tighter, his bottom lip trembling despite his best efforts. The fourth person to promise they'd be right back with help hadn't returned, and now the street was growing emptier by the minute. The wind cut through his thin jacket, carrying distant sounds of traffic and laughter from somewhere he couldn't see. Ethan had wandered just a few steps from his mother at the street fair. Now the lights and crowds were gone, leaving only darkened shops and occasional hurried pedestrians. A police officer had briefly stopped, taken notes, and promised someone would come soon. That was an hour ago. The man in the dark coat had been standing at the corner for several minutes, occasionally glancing over. Now he approached slowly, hands visible, eyes kind beneath the shadow of his cap. Something about him seemed familiar, like a character from one of the movies Ethan's dad watched. The stranger knelt down at eye level, respecting the invisible bubble of space around the frightened child. If this moment made you feel something, imagine what's coming next. Hit that like button and stay with us. Subscribe now. "Hey, buddy," the man said, his voice gentle but not condescending. "Waiting for someone?" His face was partially obscured by evening shadows, but his eyes reflected genuine concern. Ethan shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his mother's warnings about strangers battling with his desperate need for help. The teddy bear, Mr. Whiskers, remained clutched protectively against his chest, its worn fur damp from anxious tears. "My mom," Ethan managed, his voice smaller than he intended. "She was right there, and then she wasn't." He pointed vaguely toward the now empty street corner where the festival had been bustling just hours earlier. A young couple walked past, glancing curiously at the man kneeling before the child, but they didn't stop. The stranger noticed their hesitation, the quick assessment and dismissal that had become the pattern of the evening. He turned back to Ethan with a patient smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "I'm Keanu," the man said simply, still maintaining a respectful distance. "What's your name? And who's your friend there?" He nodded toward the teddy bear. Something about his calm demeanor made Ethan's shoulders relax slightly. Across the street, a woman paused to watch, her phone half raised as if debating whether to call someone or take a picture. Two teenagers stopped a few yards away, one nudging the other and pointing. "I'm Ethan. This is Mr. Whiskers," the boy answered, offering a tentative smile. "My mom said if I ever get lost, stay in one spot. But it's been really long and it's getting dark." His voice trembled on the last words. Keanu nodded seriously. The recognition was spreading. A small cluster of pedestrians had formed nearby, their conversations hushed but excited. Someone definitely had a camera out now. Keanu ignored them all, his focus entirely on the child before him. "Your mom gave you good advice, and you're being very brave," Keanu said, glancing up at the growing crowd with a slight furrow in his brow. "How about we find a warmer spot and get some help?" He pointed to a well-lit cafe across the street, its windows glowing with warm light. "We can call the police from there, and maybe get some hot chocolate while we wait. Would that be okay?" Ethan hesitated, studying the man's face. The growing audience around them made him uncomfortable, whispers and phone cameras creating a strange bubble of attention. A tall businessman who had walked past earlier now returned, hovering at the edge of the scene with a frown. "Everything okay here?" he called out, voice laced with sudden civic duty that had been absent when Ethan stood alone. Keanu turned toward him, and the man's expression changed instantly to recognition. The whispers in the crowd grew louder, the name Keanu Reeves clearly audible now. Things are about to take a turn. Don't miss what happens next. Subscribe, like our video, and keep watching. Yes, we're fine. This is Ethan, and he's been waiting for help for over an hour, Keanu replied, his voice carrying a subtle note of reproach that made several onlookers shift uncomfortably. The businessman retreated with a mumbled apology. Keanu turned back to Ethan, deliberately shielding him from the growing crowd. "What do you think about that hot chocolate, buddy?" Ethan nodded, relief washing over his face at the prospect of action after so much waiting. As they stood, Keanu offered his hand, a gesture so simple yet profound in its trust. The boy took it without hesitation. The crowd parted as they walked toward the cafe, faces lit by the blue glow of phone screens recording the moment. Behind them, a woman in designer clothes loudly proclaimed to her companion, "I was just about to help that child myself," though she had walked past him twice before without a glance. The cafe owner recognized the situation immediately, ushering them to a quiet corner booth away from the windows where onlookers pressed their faces against the glass. "Police are on their way," she said quietly to Keanu, "and I've got hot chocolate coming." Ethan slid into the booth, his teddy bear finally relaxing its position against his chest as he breathed in the warm, sweet air of the cafe. "Thank you," Keanu said to the cafe owner, a genuine smile warming his features. Outside, the crowd had doubled, cell phones recording through the windows despite the owner's disapproving glare. A local news van had even pulled up, a reporter preparing her microphone. The spectacle was building, but inside their booth, Keanu created a bubble of normalcy, asking Ethan about Mr. Whisker's adventures as the hot chocolate arrived topped with whipped cream and cinnamon. "Mom says I'm not supposed to talk to strangers," Ethan admitted between careful sips, "but you don't feel like a stranger." The innocence of the statement hung in the air as Keanu considered his response. Outside, the same officer who had taken notes earlier pushed through the crowd, looking flustered as he entered the cafe. His demeanor shifted instantly upon recognizing Keanu, embarrassment coloring his features. "Mr. Reeves, sir, the officer began, but Keanu raised a hand gently. "This is Ethan," he interrupted quietly. "He's been waiting for help since before sunset." The simple statement carried no accusation, yet the officer's face flushed deeper. Behind him, 2 more officers entered, followed by a frantic woman whose eyes darted around the cafe until they landed on Ethan. Her cry of relief cut through the murmur of the crowd. "Ethan!" The woman rushed forward, tears streaming down her face. Ethan nearly knocked over his hot chocolate as he scrambled from the booth. "Mom!" Their embrace was fierce, the woman kneeling on the cafe floor, clutching her son as if he might disappear again. Mr. Whiskers was squashed between them, a silent witness to their reunion. The officers stood awkwardly nearby, one filming discreetly with his phone. Keanu remained seated, his expression soft as he watched the reunion unfold. "I was so scared," the mother said, pulling back to examine her son's face. "I turned around and you were gone. We've been searching everywhere." Her voice broke. "The festival security told me they'd called it in, but..." She stopped, finally noticing Keanu in the booth. Her eyes widened, disbelief momentarily displacing her relief. The first officer stepped forward, clearing his throat. "Mrs. Chen, as you can see, your son is safe, thanks to the assistance of Mr. Reeves." His professional tone couldn't mask the embarrassment underneath. Outside, the crowd had swelled further, the news crews now plural. The cafe owner stood guard at the door, refusing additional entry despite the press credentials being flashed through the glass. Inside this protected space, a mother held her child. A celebrity sat quietly in a booth, and a teddy bear named Mr. Whiskers absorbed tears of relief rather than fear. This story is only getting deeper. What would you do in this situation? Comment below, and let's talk. Mrs. Chen approached the booth, Ethan's hand firmly in hers. "Mr. Reeves, I don't know how to thank you," she began, her voice steadier now, though tears still shimmered in her eyes. Keanu shook his head slightly, dismissing the need for gratitude. "Ethan did the hard part," he said, staying brave when everyone was too busy to notice. The gentle rebuke wasn't lost on the officers or the crowd watching through the windows. The first officer shifted his weight, looking at his shoes. The cafe had fallen completely silent, even the staff pausing to witness the exchange. Outside, someone shouted for Keanu to look toward the window for a photo, but the glass barrier muffled the request into irrelevance. "May I sit?" Mrs. Chen asked, gesturing to the booth. Keanu nodded, sliding over to make room. Ethan climbed in beside his mother, Mr. Whiskers now sitting on the table facing the group like a fourth participant in the conversation. The moment felt surreal. A celebrity, a mother, a child, and a teddy bear gathered around cooling hot chocolate, while a city's attention pressed against the windows. "I called for help repeatedly," Mrs. Chen said, her voice carrying in the quiet cafe. "The festival security, the police twice, they took information, but—" She trailed off, the implication clear. The first officer stepped forward as if to defend himself, but his superior placed a restraining hand on his shoulder, shaking his head slightly. "It happens every day," Keanu said quietly, "not just to children. People in need, invisible in plain sight." His words weren't performative. They carried the weight of genuine observation. Several cafe patrons looked down at their tables, recognition flickering across their faces. Through the windows, phones still recorded, but the carnival atmosphere had shifted, the excitement now tinged with something more reflective. "But you stopped," Ethan said, looking up at Keanu with uncomplicated admiration. "Nobody else did. But you did." The simple truth from a child's lips landed heavily in the room. Mrs. Chen squeezed her son's hand, her eyes meeting Keanu's with profound gratitude. One of the officers cleared his throat, uncomfortable with the implicit criticism but unable to dispute it. The cafe owner approached the table, refilling Ethan's hot chocolate and placing a fresh cup before Keanu with a respectful nod. "We need your statement, Miss Chen," the senior officer finally said, attempting to regain control of the situation. "And we should probably move to the station to complete the paperwork." His tone suggested routine, procedure, the machinery of officialdom grinding back into motion now that the crisis had passed. "Is that really necessary tonight?" Keanu asked, his voice soft but carrying authority that transcended his celebrity. "Ethan and his mother have been through enough." He wasn't playing a character now, wasn't channeling Neo or John Wick. This was simpler, more fundamental, a human being recognizing another's need for compassion over procedure. The cafe fell silent again, watching the officer's response. Outside, the crowd had grown quieter too, sensing the tension through the glass. The officer looked around, aware that whatever he said next would likely appear on social media within minutes. His partner whispered something in his ear, and the senior officer's shoulders relaxed slightly. "Perhaps we can take preliminary information here," he conceded, "and follow up tomorrow." Relief washed over Mrs. Chen's face as she hugged Ethan closer. The moment of confrontation passed, replaced by something gentler. The cafe owner appeared with sandwiches on the house, placing them before the reunited family. Through the windows, the crowd began to disperse. The immediate drama concluded, though phones still recorded the aftermath. It's not over yet. The best part is coming. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss it. As the officers collected basic information from Mrs. Chen, Keanu leaned slightly toward Ethan. "Mr. Whiskers held up pretty well through all this," he observed, nodding toward the teddy bear that sat sentinel on the table. Ethan smiled, some of the evening's trauma already beginning to transform into a story he would tell for years to come. "He's brave," Ethan said simply, then added with the direct honesty of childhood, "Will you be in the newspaper for helping me?" The question made Keanu smile, lines crinkling around his eyes. "Maybe," he acknowledged, "but that's not why I stopped." He glanced toward the windows where a few dedicated onlookers still peered in, phones at the ready. Sometimes the right thing doesn't need an audience. Mrs. Chen finished with the officers and turned back to the table. "They're sending a car to take us home," she said, relief evident in her voice. The cafe had returned to its normal rhythm, though conversations were more hushed than usual, respect for the corner booth creating an invisible boundary. Keanu nodded, gathering his coat. "I should be going," he said quietly. "I'm glad everything worked out." He stood, but before he could step away from the booth, Mrs. Chen reached out, touching his arm gently. "What you did tonight," she began, then paused, searching for adequate words. "People walked past my son for over an hour. The police took notes and left. But you," her voice caught, "you saw him when no one else would." The cafe owner approached, handing Keanu a paper bag. "Some pastries for later," she explained with a warm smile. "On the house, of course." Her eyes conveyed more than her words. A community's gratitude extended through butter and flour. Outside, a police car pulled up, its lights casting blue patterns through the cafe windows. "Your ride's here," Keanu said to Mrs. Chen and Ethan, deftly redirecting attention away from himself. Ethan slid from the booth. Mr. Whiskers once again clutched to his chest, but now in security rather than fear. The boy hesitated, then stepped forward and hugged Keanu quickly around the waist before retreating to his mother's side. The police escorted Mrs. Chen and Ethan to the waiting car, the small family framed momentarily in the doorway of the cafe, a tableau of reunion. Keanu remained inside, watching from the booth until they were safely away. The cafe owner approached again, refilling his cup without being asked. "You know, half the people filming outside walked right past that boy earlier," she said quietly. "Tomorrow they'll share the video and feel like they were part of something good." There was no bitterness in her observation, just a weary recognition of human nature. Keanu sipped his coffee thoughtfully. "Maybe that's not entirely bad," he replied. "Sometimes we need reminders of who we want to be." He glanced around the cafe where patrons were stealing glances, some pretending not to recognize him, others openly appreciative. The night's drama was already spreading through social media, the story growing and changing with each share. By morning, millions would watch a celebrity kneel before a lost child, would witness kindness that demanded nothing in return. They would tag friends, leave comments, debate society's failures, and celebrate its potential. But here in the aftermath, a man simply finished his coffee, left a generous tip, and walked back into the night, carrying pastries and the weight of seeing what others had missed. Wow, what a story! If this moved you, imagine what else we have for you. Hit that like button, drop a comment, and let us know what you think.